and welcome to CMTV episode 11. I'm Aubrey Going.
And I'm Alison Kavanagh.
So we have a few different things to discuss today, Annie. I think you were particularly going to talk about inflammation.
Yeah, and even the effects of arthritis and effects of inflammation on skin conditions.
Yeah, I'm going to talk just briefly about an injury we were talking about on a recent seminar. One of the things that might predispose people to a cruciate ligament injury. So kind of sort of related topics that we're going to be talking about: inflammation, particularly as it relates to arthritis, and then injury, which I suppose as manual therapists we tend to think of inflammation more as an outcome of traumatic injury, but it is also a response of the immune system, which
Yeah,
is going to be quite interesting. I suppose first of all, maybe defining what inflammation is. So we'd say inflammation is your immune system's response to injury or infection,
yeah.
which is kind of what we said.
And I think just this time of year, we're just after the Christmas break, and maybe people have indulged a lot in the festivities and had high sugar content and maybe alcohol consumption a little higher than usual. And I just noticed in the clinic that a lot of people are coming in with inflammation patterns that they haven't had for a while. And it got me thinking about the alcohol consumption, the high level of sugar in the diet. Was this contributing to some of the inflammatory responses and the aches and pains that I was seeing in the clinic the past 2 weeks?
It's funny you hear people talk about that as well. Like, do we really have a flu season, or do we have a season of maybe suppressed immunity because we've increased the things that are going to interfere with immune response, like increasing our sugar intake, like increasing our alcohol, and not being aware of how to maybe build back up afterwards? Because these were people that you were saying were doing really well
Before Christmas.
pre-Christmas,
Yeah,
and then all of a sudden post-Christmas.
flare-ups.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay, quite interesting.
yeah.
So we'd imagine that it would be important to have a broad view, because it's not like that people shouldn't celebrate.
Hmm.
You know, you should if you're in really good health. If you've done the small regular things week in, week out, every month of the year, then occasional indulgences are going to be fine.
Yeah,
But if maybe things are below par to begin with, and then we really overdo it,
yeah,
we
too
overindulge,
consistent.
that's when we'll start to see those negative outcomes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we said inflammation. If we were looking at a kind of a broader definition, we'd say inflammation occurs when the body releases chemicals that trigger the immune response to fight off either infection or damaged tissue. So in the case of infection, we have things like foreign bodies.
Yeah.
Typically, we think of like
Pathogens,
viruses, yeah,
bacteria,
bacteria, things like that.
fungi,
Yeah.
spores.
So things that shouldn't be there, and the body's going to tackle them. But in the case of traumatic injury, we do often have like broken down cells, damaged proteins.
Cytokine storms.
Yeah, we don't oftentimes get this kind of cell necrosis as well, where a lot of cells will die, and you have this kind of widespread, but it might be quite limited in terms of the overall structure of the body, but a lot of cells. And that the immune response is going to be important there to come in. And some of those immune cells literally envelop and digest. They have digestive enzymes to break down the what we could simply call debris. So damaged structures, damaged cells, whatever it might be, as well
Particles
as,
of cells.
yeah, in the case of trauma, and then in case of infection, it's going to be the damaged bacteria or virally infected cells.
Hmm.
So it's actually a similar enough process, even though we think of these as
Different
quite
things,
different things. Yeah,
mechanisms. Yeah.
yeah.
I think with arthritis, you can see, flare-ups of arthritis and then it going into remission.
Mm,
So you can have the acute stage of inflammation, but
mm,
then you can have a chronic ongoing inflammation, a low-grade inflammation that doesn't quite clear up. I think diet and lifestyle can contribute a lot to the body
mm,
healing from chronic inflammation.
yeah.
So maybe if we talk about acute inflammation, signs and symptoms
Yeah, true.
in
Yeah.
injury scenarios.
Yeah, because again, coming at it from a bodywork perspective, we tend to see more the injury scenario. We see inflammation in that circumstance rather than the infection, where people are more likely to seek medical intervention. They may go see their doctor for steroids or antibiotics, things like that. So when we think in terms of traumatic injury, we would say that you have
A
the
mechanism of injury.
yeah, there's oftentimes like a tissue has been loaded beyond its capacity to resist shearing force or tensile load. And then collagen fibers will give way, tissue damage occurs, we get rupture of tendons, ligaments, muscles, whatever it might be.
Hmm.
So when that happens, we talk about like the ideal is we go from the initial acute phase where there is inflammation in the tissues, and that's going to be evidenced by the cardinal signs, which we'd say is pain is going to be the main one, and then pain with some of the other signs like redness, swelling, and heat. And the more severe the inflammation, the more pronounced those signs are going to be. And this is going to be most obvious in the extremities.
Yeah.
You know, if it's deep in the torso, it might not be visible at the surface. So it's going to be most apparent in the
Hmm.
extremities. So that initial phase is oftentimes referred to as the acute phase, which means sharp or pointed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you may get loss of function with that. If there's enough swelling in the area, you
Yeah.
may get a fifth.
That'll be kind of our fifth sign. Yeah.
Yeah.
Typically, we talk about those four as the cardinal,
Yeah.
but yeah, when it's severe enough, we'll oftentimes get loss of function. We'll see that in musculoskeletal problems, oftentimes as loss of range of motion or loss of ability to put load on that tissue.
Yeah.
Like your ankle wouldn't be weight bearing if you've badly sprained it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be too painful.
So that's usually from the time the impact or injury occurs up
Mm.
to the first 3 days. We would characterize that as acute
Yeah.
inflammatory
So 48
phase.
to 72 hours. So we
Hmm.
could say 2 to 3 days.
Hmm.
And all going well, those inflammatory processes are subsiding or mostly resolved by the time we're kind of into day 4. It's
Hmm.
not always the case, but we're describing ideal scenarios. So then we move into what's called the subacute phase, so the less pointed.
Yeah.
And this is where a lot of the kind of the repair is taking place.
Yeah, I think
And
that 3 days to 3 weeks is kind of that
yeah,
window
yeah,
for subacute.
yeah. And where we can start to move a little bit more, we start to regain function. And hopefully that movement will direct the growth of healthy, functionally aligned collagen fibers. So we don't get as much of a scar tissue formation. We don't get this crossing over, this mishmash of fiber direction that results in weak tissue that can easily re-injure.
Hmm.
So then after that 3 week phase, if symptoms persist, and hopefully if repair has been good, they don't, but if symptoms continue beyond that 3 weeks, it's referred to as the chronic phase.
Hmm.
So we said acute means sharp or pointed, particularly sharp pain, subacute, less sharp, and then chronic comes from the root word chronos, so it's the passage of time. So symptoms that are continuing on through time.
Hmm.
But often we find with chronic conditions, things haven't resolved fully. And sometimes we do have low level inflammation,
Yes.
which sounds counter to what we just said, because we said normally that's the first 2 to 3 days,
Hmm.
but there can be inflammatory processes, not maybe as wide scale.
Hmm.
And then there are conditions, like we said, arthritis, which we'll go through. Uh, it's a chronic condition, but then goes through these flare ups that are oftentimes referred to as an acute flare up because things get a little bit more pointed.
Which is quite interesting when you think of rheumatism as opposed to maybe osteoarthritis. Rheumatism is classed as an autoimmune disease that
Mhm.
white blood cells are attacking the lining of the joint,
Yeah.
whereas the wear and tear that we see with maybe the aging process would have a different type of inflammatory response.
Yeah.
But there's foods that are inflammatory foods and there's foods that are anti-inflammatory foods.
Mm.
So there's a lot of lifestyle changes that we can make to minimize this low grade level of inflammation.
Which is one of the factors they oftentimes talk about, where they'll say like conditions like arthritis are oftentimes thought to be hereditary, which means it's going to be part of gene expression.
Hmm.
But then there's oftentimes that debate of how much of it is inherited and how much of it is lifestyle, and it's oftentimes really there's a bit of both,
Nature and nurture.
nature, nurture. So if you have a genetic predisposition, you can combat that to a fair extent through lifestyle choices
Yeah.
or exacerbate. It'd be more likely to be expressed. Because oftentimes you grow up in the same household, you develop the same habits, the same tastes, the same likes and dislikes.
Same
So,
beliefs.
same beliefs and all the rest.
Outlooks.
Yeah. So, there can be an element of both. But if you have a tendency towards inflammatory type conditions, if you have a tendency, there's arthritis in the family,
Hmm.
then this is going to be particularly important when we look at what foods may increase the risk of that inflammatory response and what foods can we use to decrease and really prevent those flare ups that you could have the gene expression, but yet be symptom free, not suffer.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think I'd put skin conditions in with that, like psoriasis, eczema, dermatitis, because some people class that as arthritis of the skin, the
Hmm.
type of arthritis. There's over maybe 200 different types of arthritis. And I think a big surprise for me was realizing that there was a big role in foods that you eat. The more unusual one that people maybe haven't heard of is the nightshade family, that there's
Yeah.
a particular product in nightshade, uh, solonin, solonin,
So, Yeah, however we pronounce it.
Solanine.
We'll put the name in the show notes.
Yes, solanine. And about a third of arthritis sufferers are really sensitive to this, and it can cause inflammation or inflammatory processes in the body. And it's in foods like potatoes, what we would typically call white potatoes,
Mm.
foods like tomatoes. Tomatoes are fine if they're cooked, that acid reduces, but raw tomato, things like bell peppers and aubergines. So it's about making useful swaps. If a recipe had aubergine in it, maybe substitute it with courgette,
Mm.
something that isn't nightshade. But it even includes spices like chili peppers, paprika, chili flakes, um, that are added to food to season.
Yeah,
And I notice when I talk to my clients that suffer with arthritis, they're usually the foods they live on.
crave.
Oh, I eat tomatoes practically like an apple, and I'm like, no. If they're one that,
If they have that
yeah,
tendency.
if they have that tendency, so about a third of people have that tendency.
Because I know I certainly had that reaction. I think what a lot of people would have is when you first said about the nightshade, I would think of deadly nightshade, but it's a whole family that
Mm.
contains that acid.
Yes.
And if you have sensitivity, so these are oftentimes, they're not unhealthy foods, like they're actually perfectly good for you. Do you want to move pop
Yep.
it? So apologies. So there are foods that would be perfectly okay for a reasonable percentage of the population to consume. They're not going to have a reaction to that acid.
The whole
But for
block
people who do have
all
that
the way around the
sensitivity,
front.
it will be important to avoid those foods, particularly
So
during
hidden
more
hearing,
acute inflammation. That then would
commenter,
be
that's the
particularly
red
important.
door at the
So
front.
it's not that those
Thanks.
foods need to be avoided for everybody or that they're unhealthy foods, but people who have that gene expression, that tendency towards the kind of rheumatism or the skin related ailments that we would oftentimes think of that we said are almost like arthritis of the skin, those people should avoid those foods. Because yeah, I thought nightshade as a more narrower definition when you had first said it, and it was only after you were explaining it I was going, oh yeah, that does actually make sense. And I would have always said I love tomato in things, meaning cooked,
Hmm.
whereas I always had a absolute
Aversion.
aversion to uncooked raw tomato.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And even though I wouldn't suffer those tendencies, it
Yeah.
was just a personal taste thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe looking at some of the foods that cause inflammation.
Yeah.
So things with a high sugar content
Mm.
are going to be inflammatory. So avoiding fizzy drinks or sodas, um, energy drinks, confectionery, sweets, biscuits, cakes,
Because people
donuts.
will oftentimes have a blind spot about the thing they like. They'll say, "Oh no, I don't eat any of that." But oh no, I do like a slice of cake every evening or
Or I
something,
have to have a bicky with my cup of tea.
Yeah, yeah. And they don't associate it because they don't eat the other foods.
Yeah.
Some people will be, wagging their finger at the youths these days with their energy drinks and
Mm.
yet still be consuming sugars in a form that they think is perfectly okay.
Yeah.
So it's really any of those, the refined sugar
Yeah.
in processed food.
Is acidic.
Yeah.
Other acidic things, obviously alcohol. So limiting consumption of alcohol, that can deplete and dry out the liver as well. So
Yeah.
it runs down our oily nutrients.
Yeah.
Avoiding damaged oils, so deep fried foods, crisps, chips.
We talked about the oil, so don't forget to check out maybe episode 10 of our podcast, where we went into seed oils and things like that. What surprised me is when we started to look, the amount of foods that are now cooked in cottonseed oil that hadn't been previously. So I think crisps in particular,
Yeah,
and again, you can probably find healthy swaps, but crisps, crackers, most people think I'm being healthy, I'm not eating biscuits, I'm eating crackers, but they have a lot of seed oils in them.
yeah.
And that could be an irritant. And surprisingly, like microwave popcorn as well.
Hmm.
If you're making your own popcorn, not so bad, but you
Yeah,
are still heating the oil.
yeah,
Um, but a lot of those, the commercial pop it in the bag kind of thing, they oftentimes have seed oils in them as well.
yeah.
Mm.
Refined flour, so your breads and your pastas get thrown into that category as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Um,
Refined white flour in particular. So you
yes,
found that sometimes some of the um, sourdoughs were okay
yeah,
in moderation.
in moderation, you get away
And,
with a
and
small bit.
presumably then when you have more of an acute flare up, you probably avoid those things altogether.
Yeah,
And then
for
when
two
things are
weeks.
doing fairly well, you might be okay to
Introduce
eat
them,
small amounts. Yeah.
yeah, back
Yeah.
in. So really ultra processed food, the alcohol, high alcohol, high sugar consumption, and then processed meats.
Yeah.
Again, I think that's kind of damaged fats, maybe a certain amount of nitrates,
Nitrates
nitrites.
and nitrites they talk about in particular, yeah,
Yeah,
that are used as preservatives in a lot of processed meat. And by processed meat, we mean like kind of the sliced
lunch meats,
lunch
ham,
meats, things like that. Yeah,
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 salami.
yeah. That if you were to get like a good organic ham and cook it yourself,
Yeah,
then you don't have as many of those preservatives. It is kind of the pre-prepared, pre-packaged foods or kind of the deli counter sort of stuff, not to pick on delis, but
yeah.
yeah, where it's more processed.
Process that
Yeah.
would be so that's a fairly wide range, and people often say, oh my gosh, well, what can I eat then? So I think we should look at um food
Foods that would be actually anti-inflammatory.
inflammatory.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that would help.
yeah,
Okay, so we had a couple of foods on the list. I thought avocados was quite an interesting one
yeah.
because they'd say the type of fat in avocados is very healthy. There's good protein. Like all round, it's a pretty
Nutrient dense
nutrient
food.
dense food. Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't like the label superfood because that was something that became a real buzzword. There is no definition. It's just that's really good, but there isn't like people that say, "Oh, that's a superfood." And you're going, by what measure?
yeah,
What there is no classification. That's not a thing.
yeah,
It's a buzzword. It's a marketing thing. But
yeah,
if we were to apply it to a food, avocados probably come pretty close because of their broad makeup and
yeah,
the high quality fats they contain.
yeah.
Good.
I think for arthritis in particular, the omega-3
Mm,
is very important. So
the
fish
particular fat.
oils,
And yeah.
yeah, and oily fish. So wild salmon, herring, mackerel, um, sardines,
Mm,
yeah, for a low cost
yeah.
alternative is a really good substitute.
Mm,
So really any oily fish, and if you can take an oily supplement, we have a brand here, Seven Seas, that do
mm,
a max strength EPA. So one capsule is equivalent to two of the ordinary ones,
mm.
and it helps the body make synovial fluid, helps to lubricate the joints, and just a really useful supplement.
Good for the function of the liver as well. Like it maintains the proper suppleness of tissues to a fair extent as well.
Yeah,
And a big part of our brain
yeah.
being made up of fats as well. So the quality of fats really going to interfere or going to influence how well the brain
Mood and
functions and mood and
yeah,
even things like depression in some cases and things like that and attention. Um,
avoiding brain fog.
Brain fog. Speaking of which, I can't. What's the thing? No, it wasn't. But you were saying beets as well, that you particularly like beets.
Yeah, a lot of root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, turnips, and beetroot, a
Mm,
good organic beetroot.
yeah,
Um, you're kind of getting the colors of the rainbow there, plenty of antioxidants as well. So
yeah.
all of those are excellent. Uh,
Olive oil would probably put in there as well.
olive oil, absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
good quality extra virgin olive
And
oil.
again, with all the oils, we said really important that the oil isn't damaged through the heating process.
Heat,
So,
light, or oxygen
yeah,
exposure.
yeah. And just to be careful to try to get like, it's very hard to get a truly cold pressed oil. We talked about Udo's oil before and how he developed a water cooled press because the mechanical force of pressing oftentimes generates some heat.
Mm-hmm.
So the first pressing, the virgin pressing of the olive oil is
It's
going to
the
be the
best.
best because it's the least heat. There's certainly some
Exposure.
heat added to it to extract more, which
Mm-hmm.
they normally do with later pressings.
Mm-hmm.
So really additive free, cold pressed, extra virgin. But olive oil really good, particularly when just used raw, like not used in cooking, like drizzled over salads, drizzled on foods. Really,
Yeah,
really good. Put it on your rice. It really does add an awful lot to both texture, nutrition, and flavor
yeah,
to pour onto a
absolutely.
lot of foods. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have reduce alcohol, reduce sugar, increase good oils, avoid damaged oils,
Mm.
um, plenty of salads, green leafy vegetables, fish, and
And we said getting oils from nuts as well.
yes,
Nuts can be a good source.
ideally if you can get them unshelled, and that means getting out your nutcracker and opening the nuts.
I've recently seen, and I don't like to particularly promote any one supermarket chain, but Tesco's recently had shell nuts in their shells, unshelled nuts. I keep going to say shelled. That means with the shell removed. Obviously, we mean in the shell because that acts as a seal that it's preventing oxygen damage, which would be causing the oil to slowly go rancid.
Hmm.
So when you buy nuts that have already been taken out of their shell, that protective mechanism has been taken away. And so the oil is gradually going off. It's becoming rancid. It's becoming more harmful than healthy.
Yeah.
So having the nut still in its shell is really going to be the best protection you can get.
Yeah.
It does mean a little bit of extra work, but then convenience sometimes comes at the cost of a less healthy product.
Mm-hmm.
If you want a more healthy product, it's sometimes a little less convenient. You have to get out the nutcracker, as you said, and crack your own
Yes.
shell to get the freshest possible nut.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So things like walnuts, um,
Almonds,
pecans, almonds,
mm, cashews,
cashews are pretty good.
hazelnuts.
Hazelnuts,
Yeah.
macadamia nuts,
Yeah, macadamia actually, if they're properly
fresh.
shelled and fresh and all the rest, they're said to have a really high fat content, a really healthy, nutritionally valuable fat. But again, not heated, not roasted nuts,
Yeah.
ideally in its shell. Certainly not the trend for the last little while has been candied nuts in a salad, like where they deep fry sugar onto them or do something. As you're kind of going, now you've just defeated the whole purpose.
Yeah.
You might as well throw jelly tots on it or, some kind of confectionery.
Yeah.
Yeah. And organic eggs.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
were saying
High
for
quality protein,
good
choline,
fats,
at all.
yeah, a whole range of things, like almost like the avocado, a very complete food in and of itself.
Yeah. Easy to digest.
And
Yes.
different fashions kind of come and go. Some people would only eat the yellow, some people only eat the white. The two together is what gives you the complete proteins
Yeah.
that I think really are better off eating the whole thing. And people will talk about cholesterol and things like that. And really, your body is producing excessive cholesterol, we said, to soothe inflammatory responses. But
Particularly in blood vessels.
yeah, the cholesterol itself is the protective mechanism, and yet it's being seen as the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
We should be trying to figure out why is your body overdoing the protective mechanism and deal with that
Yeah.
instead of attacking cholesterol.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's a whole
So
nother can of worms.
it
Sorry, go
is
ahead.
indeed. Yeah, so really the small day-to-day changes of the food choices that you're making have a huge overall impact.
Mm,
Going back to healing the gut
mm,
so that the immune system can work properly,
yeah.
supplying the foods in a natural state as possible, as close to their natural state. Good oils, get rid of the damaged oils, reduce sugar, and alcohol.
And when we were kids, Dad used to talk about eating pears as well. Like sometimes even if you had some kind of acute flare up, like you've got a little bit of appendicitis type pain,
Yeah.
he would say to give the digestive system a break
Yeah.
and reduce inflammatory responses, eating only pears
Yeah.
for a day,
Yeah, and it could be raw pears or stewed pears or whatever way you liked your
so long
pears.
as it was just
Pears.
pears. Yeah, and it worked.
It really did because
Yeah.
if the fiber in the pears feeding the good gut bacteria,
Mm,
they're easy to break down and digest, and there's some carbohydrate in it to give you some energy. So,
yeah,
yeah,
good.
good choice. Yeah, so that's pretty much all I'd say on the uh, inflammatory and arthritic.
Yeah.
So if you've overdone it at Christmas, it's time to give it up before Lent.
And we'll put those list of foods in the show notes as well, so you can have an idea of which foods are going to be unfortunately promoting inflammatory responses, increasing inflammation, and then which foods can you start to introduce more into your diet to decrease the inflammatory responses.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. Anything else then before we
No,
talk a little bit about the cruciate?
that's good.
Okay, so I'm going to share my favorite app, 3D for Medical. So let's So if we think of these as like, said, two eggs sitting in two egg cups, we find in martial arts, now not all people, because there was the girl we were talking to, she had a different mechanism of injury that was on the seminar. But for a lot of people engaged in martial arts, it's oftentimes the leg they're standing on that they manage to tear the cruciate. You'd imagine it's the striking leg.
Mm.
But when you are standing on one leg, if your weight is more on one side than the other, if you pivot and your foot stays in place, like you should really be up on the ball of your foot when you're doing those kind of maneuvers so that you can pivot your whole leg. But if the leg is planted and you pivot from that position, it shifts the weight. So now instead of the rotation happening in the middle of the joint, when you're on one side, you then are pivoting around that fulcrum, which then loads, and if you're unfortunate, overloads and can tear the meniscus. Sorry, not the meniscus, the anterior
Cruciate.
cruciate. It can also lead to meniscus tears, but it can pop that anterior cruciate quite easily. Because that was something that baffled me when I initially heard it. I was going, how would you do it on the stance leg?
Hmm.
And it is that it's weight going onto one condyle instead of the other. Now, the predisposing factor there is that the tibia has a tendency to be rotated out on a lot of people.
Hmm.
The degree varies. Some people it's very mild and you don't suffer any issues. But the more rotated it is, the more predisposed you are to that type of anterior cruciate ligament injury, particularly if you're involved in something like kicking or combat sports. So the best thing to do then would be to get that tibia back out of rotation,
Hmm.
which we teach in a number of our seminars. We also have videos on a really important corrective exercise, how to stretch the short head of bicep femoris. So this is one of your hamstrings on the outside. And because it doesn't cross the knee, across the hip like the other hamstrings, it only crosses the knee, it has a greater mechanical advantage, more tendency to turn the tibia out. So we've got a really good stretch on that, along with tons of other content on our subscription, our streaming channel. It's Watch HCD. So again, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Definitely a very useful home rehab that you can do to take the tibia out of rotation and reduce the risk. It's never going to make you bulletproof, but it can reduce one of the factors that might lead you more to be predisposed to an anterior cruciate ligament tear.
Yep, I see it a lot in the clinic. People just suffering with knee pain,
Mm,
and there's rotation in the lower leg.
yeah,
And when you do the techniques that take the knee out of rotation, and the knee pain can go in one session.
yeah.
So pretty phenomenal work.
Yeah, wrote an article on that for Massage and Myotherapy, the journal, a while back, where we talked about how there are so many different structures around the knee that can be potential generators of knee pain, or causes, we could say, really generators of knee pain. And all of them are going to be exacerbated by that rotation in the tibia.
Hmm.
So, with the vast, vast majority of knee pain, you can certainly help reduce symptoms, in some cases, eliminate symptoms just by getting that tibia back into place. And if you do it as a preventative measure, it means you're at less at risk for things like anterior cruciate ligament rupture, meniscus tears, patellar tracking problems, contralateral patella, a whole host of
Slew.
conditions. The list goes on and on and on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then just on a sadder note, unfortunately, one of the legends of our bodywork industry, Dr. Eric Dalton, passed away on Saturday, the 11th of January, on his 81st birthday.
Yeah.
So we'd just like to pay tribute to his expertise, his mentorship, his bringing together of the bodywork industry,
Mhm.
and lasting friendships were made
Yeah.
through the connection with Eric.
I talked to Till Luca about this, and we did a short interview. Himself and Whitney are putting together a tribute. I was delighted to be asked to contribute to that, to Eric's life and legacy. That'll be coming out shortly, and I'm sure we'll be posting clips about that as well. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, definitely a sad day for the bodywork industry. He will certainly be missed.
Yes, he was a luminary, and I think his work will be carried on through his people that he got to share his knowledge with, his teaching assistants and top educators
Mm,
like yourself, Aubrey.
yeah. Yes. So
Yeah,
on that note, we'll thank you for watching, and we hope to see you for episode 12.
thanks. Take care. Bye now.